Welcome to Executive Development Part 2, Building and Sustaining Trust. As you know, these are self-directed learning programs that you can go through at your own pace. The approximate time to go through the entire program is around an hour. And what you'll find is there's going to be hand-in-hand coaching as it relates to a lot of this material. This gives you the opportunity to review a lot of the content prior to your coaching calls, so we can focus on education and execution versus spending a lot of time looking at videos and some of the other material. So it allows us to take advantage in a more productive and effective way during our coaching calls. So let's get started. When we talk about building and sustaining trust and building a trusting culture, we found that it boils down to three core elements. The first element is being trustworthy. Understanding the skills and the competencies around character and trust, around character and competency, I should say, that allows you to become and be trustworthy. The second element is having a skill and competency for having difficult conversations. The timing, the process, and the mindset for having difficult conversations. The third element is knowing how to accept and use feedback. This is something that we discussed before in the debriefing part of the executive development process. And this applies even more so in this particular area. So knowing how to accept and use feedback. All three of these areas interact with building and sustaining a high trust culture, which leads into our learning objectives. Is 1, the importance of creating a culture of trust. 2, learn 13 behaviors for building trust. 3, how to lead conversations that build trust when the stakes are high. And 4, how to facilitate conversations when difficult decisions must be made. And then finally, how to accept feedback during difficult conversations. All these areas get into those three things that I talked about earlier: being trustworthy, having difficult conversations, and knowing how to use and receive feedback. The material that we're going to use for this particular program is, first, it's from over 12 years of research that we've gained from coaching clients, from working with building high-performing teams, for dealing with a lot of trust issues between teams, between boards, and we've cataloged a lot of that information, as well as dived into some of the best-selling books on this topic, such as Difficult Conversations, Crucial Conversations, Feedback, and a lot of the work that's been done by the Covey Institute, particularly focusing on trust. And we are, Carter & Reynolds Group, we are certified presenters of a lot of the Covey material. So let's get right into the importance of creating a culture of trust.
Never has there been more required of leaders and organizations than there is today. Expectations are higher than ever. Change is faster than ever. And the pressure to perform is unrelenting. And at the end of the day, you're still accountable for results. For many leaders, even good leaders, it seems like everything, even the simple things, take longer and cost more. So what's missing? Engagement? Collaboration? Innovation? Leadership? After working with thousands of teams and organizations all over the world, we have come to know this: most organizational performance issues are actually trust issues in disguise. The simple, often overlooked fact is this: work gets done with and through people. Organizations are made up of an infinite number of human connections, and those connections are held together by trust. That's why there is nothing more impactful on people, their work, and their performance than trust. You can see the symptoms of low trust everywhere. Like a virus, the symptoms show up as disengagement, lethargic execution, resistance to change, and lack of collaboration. But what if you could see trust? Not just the symptoms, but what if you could actually see trust? What if you could see the level of trust in an organization? What if you could see the level of trust in your organization? And more importantly, what if you could see the level of trust within your own team? What would you notice that you don't normally see? You'd see that even on teams with good, honest, capable people, counterfeit behavior diminishes trust and undermines performance. And once you see it, the destructive impact of counterfeit behavior becomes clear. But here's the tricky part. Trust begins with you. It starts with your own credibility. In the same way that you can behave your way out of trust through counterfeit behavior, you can also learn to intentionally increase your credibility and behave your way into trust. In fact, there are 13 specific behaviors found in every collaborative, engaged, high-trust, high-performing culture. In order to compete in today's world, creating a high-trust culture is not just a nice-to-have, it's a necessity. It is the foundation of all high-performing organizations. To survive and thrive, leaders need to inspire their people and lead teams that are agile, collaborative, innovative, and engaged. You can unknowingly ignore, underestimate, or neglect the laws that govern trust, but they will not ignore you. We've spent the last 20 years developing the framework and process for creating the one thing that drives all organizational performance. We're Franklin Covey, and we know trust.
So let's look at the tool, 13 behaviors for being trustworthy. Now, this is a tool that we use between individuals or with teams. We've also done work where we've looked at organizational wide, where there might be opportunities to improve trust. In this particular document, we look at the behavior, the attribute, and what's working and what's not working. And so what I'll do is go through each of the behaviors. I won't go through each item. I won't go through each of the attributes. What I will do is just point out maybe one or two within each attribute that we find to be a really strong driver of collaboration, of trust, and I'll just point that out. But I encourage you to take the time to look at each of the attributes and see which ones speak to you as relates to that particular behavior. So for straight talk, what we find, the elements that jump out is letting people know where they stand, don't manipulate people or distort facts under straight talk, and then under demonstrate respect is respect the dignity of every person and show little kindness. Show kindness on little things. Please and thank you. Surprised to know just how huge of an impact that has in talking with people and just expressing that sense of thank you and please and how that translates in a lot of people's mind, especially coming from high levels, a sense of respect. Under create transparency, the areas that come up are being open and authentic. And then when you do something that maybe it's not right or maybe a little rude, just to apologize and to do it quickly. And we find that has huge impacts of building trust, just those simple things. Show loyalty, deliver results. The areas that jump out here are acknowledge the contribution of others and don't disclose others' private information. which are two areas that can have a huge impact on tearing apart trust. Delivering results, do the right things, get the right things done. And that's essentially making sure that throughout the organization, you are aligned around those things that are considered the most important and the highest priorities. Because we've seen quite a bit of breakdown in trust just around the results area when the expectation around the results just aren't clear. Get better, confront reality. The areas that jump out here are develop a feedback system where people can constantly get an idea, both formal and informally, how well they're doing. And then also providing and making sure that we don't assume that the knowledge and skills will be sufficient for today, for tomorrow's challenges. So essentially getting better, growing in knowledge and so forth. And then confront reality is take issues head on, even the undiscussable, and address the tough stuff directly. One leader did something that I found was very interesting. When he started the meeting, he told people, what I'd like you to do is take a minute and just write down things that you believe in our organization and on our team are undiscussable. That there are elephants in the room that we just don't talk about. And just write them down. He was surprised by how long the list was. But he also told them that we're not going to talk about them today. I just want to get a sense of what they might be. Because what I want to do is tackle these issues one by one based on a priority in which you feel are blocking you from being successful. It turned out to be a very powerful thing for them in terms of building, a high-performing team. Clarify expectations and practice accountability. The areas here that jump out is don't assume the expectations are clear or shared. It's important to follow up around those things and then be clear on how you communicate how you're doing and how others are doing. "12 and 13 are listen first and keeping commitments. The two areas of focus there is don't assume you know what matters most to others, and don't assume you have all the answers or all the questions. And then keeping commitments, say what you mean, and essentially mean what you say. I mean, critical in terms of integrity. And finally, extend trust. The key area here is learn how to appropriately extend trust to others based on the situation, risk, and credibility. Learn how to balance character and competence. And that's what we find the high-performing leaders are able to do, is getting a quick sense of how much someone has earned the trust and how to work with them in order to build their capacity to earn a greater degree of trust. And this is something that we'll talk more about in various coaching sessions because we see trust as being a critical issue. So again, this is a tool that we use, and we use it in working with teams, and we use it in working with two individuals or a selection of individuals for whatever reason that's been a breakdown in trust. And this starts the conversation around what can be done to rebuild that trust. The next area we moved in is preparing for the conversation. So let's say you spend time, you have an idea where there's a breakdown in trust, and let's say you've used the tool, and you have a greater sense of, the things that you need to talk about in order to repair trust that's been broken. So getting ready to have that conversation is what we're going to be talking about now. Some principles to keep in mind is the first principle is going in to a difficult conversation should be to improve the relationship. That should be the mindset going in. Not for revenge or not to really show them that they don't know what they're talking about or whatever the case might be. Because if that's the mindset, it's going to end up badly. So we say the going in mindset to difficult conversations, especially around building trust or where trust has been violated, going in with the mindset to improve the relationship. The second one is every conversation by a leader is an opportunity to advance trust. And then the third is the focus of difficult conversations should be enhance the future of the relationship and not to justify any actions in the past. So what I'd like to do is show you a short video on how to lead conversations that build trust when the stakes are high. Now this discussion is done by Dr. Kohan, who has a PhD in leading difficult conversations. And he's led difficult conversations in boardrooms, between countries, between unions, and even in the criminal justice system. And so he's going to give a couple of examples and a couple of really tips or practices on how to handle these high-stake conversations. So I'll start it.
I'm in a concrete maze the size of 72 football fields. I'm being led from checkpoint to checkpoint, and before each door opens, the door behind me slams shut. The lock echoes while I'm searched and interviewed again. It's a maximum security jail, the largest in the country, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, Illinois. I'm here for the meeting, I say again, repeat my credentials. It's my first time visiting a jail, and everyone can tell. They take my phone, they take my keys, and they take my little bag of almonds. Almonds. Finally, I'm left in a room with two men who stare at me as I enter. One is a gang leader, the other is a corrections officer, and each of them is the size of 4 of me, which basically means I'm outnumbered 8-1. Their arms are strapped across their chests, flashes of anger in their eyes. I'm terrified, and I'm thinking they were worried about my almonds? The heavy door behind me slams shut. It's just the 3 of us now. No one moves. Now, who's had the very same experience? But whether you're a C-level executive or a spouse or you're a part of any kind of team, you probably know this to be true, that one conversation can change everything. So I want you to think of a tough conversation that people around you need to have. You got it? There's some issue that's holding them back from accomplishing what they want to accomplish. I believe they might be one conversation away from accomplishing that thing, but they're not having the conversation they need to have, or they've tried and it hasn't gone well. I've led some pretty tough conversations in some pretty tough environments. Northern Ireland, the Middle East, corporate boardrooms. I actually have a PhD in leading difficult conversations, and here's what I've learned. We're not having the conversations we need to have, and that's mostly because we're afraid. We don't want to make things worse. But not having these conversations, or having them poorly, is really bad. And most of us know this from our work. Some issue arises for a team. It could be a minor issue, but it goes unaddressed. Frustration sets in. Communication constricts. Tensions rise. Trust evaporates. And collaboration is done. Remember, we're talking about teams that perform surgeries, land planes, run schools. Many of us are a part of teams that perform crucial functions. We can't afford to avoid tough conversations. So that conversation that you thought of, that people around you need to have, you can lead that conversation. And I'm going to give you 3 simple rules to being vastly more effective in leading it. Wherever you use these rules, at work, at home, people are going to thank you. And then they'll start reaching goals they couldn't reach before, and they will come and find you and thank you again. And you'll benefit because the people around you will be more successful, not miserable, which makes your life better. So, the 3 rules. Rule number 1. Move toward the conflict. Most of us don't like conflict, but it's normal, healthy, and totally human. Without conflict, problems hide everywhere. Big problems, problems we all want to solve. So, conflict is information. And handled well, conflict is opportunity. So rather than running from it or pretending it's not there, move toward it. More on this in a minute. But rule number 2, you don't know anything. And even if you do, pretend you don't. Ask questions about people's experiences and listen to what they say. Important things will be said because you're there listening, and the better you listen, the better the people having the conversation will listen to each other. And finally, rule 3, keep quiet. Don't panic in the few seconds it takes for people to respond. They just need time. If you're jumpy about pauses, they'll see that and lose confidence in the conversation. Some of the best breakthroughs I've seen in really difficult conversations have emerged out of a brief period of silence. Don't rush in to rescue everyone from that awkward moment. It's your job to show them that moment is okay. Now, let me tell you about some tough conversations where these 3 rules saved the day. We left off in the Cook County Jail with an inmate population that has at times swelled to above 10,000. It's not an easy place to be. But getting released and not winding up back inside is also difficult. Inmates are released into gang territory, often with no way to get home, if they have a home. And the barriers to finding housing, employment, and education are such that it's no wonder so many return to the jail again and again, back through the system. So my team convened every stakeholder we could. Former gang members, business leaders, corrections officers in the jail, social workers, the sheriff's office, clergy, to see if they could start working together. City officials warned me not to bring all of these groups together. But I felt no chance of success without having this tough conversation. Well, the first meeting came, and whatever I tried, nothing worked. The groups wouldn't sit next to each other, wouldn't even look at each other. The gang leader and the corrections officer I told you about before, they were the first to arrive that day. This was the toughest conversation I've ever led. We take a break, and I'm desperate. I approach that corrections officer, who hasn't said a single word all morning. And I just go for it. I charge up to him, and I say, "Hey, buddy, what do I got to do to get you to pipe down in there?" And he looks at me like, and I think I looked at him kind of like, remember, rule number 1, move toward the conflict. Miraculously, he doesn't squish me. He actually laughs and says, "Nah, I'm not much for talking." But because I had moved toward the conflict and called out the obvious, I had a small opening with him, and the disastrous meeting was about to start again, and I needed something. I needed him. Rule number 2, you don't know anything. And even if you do, pretend you don't. So I asked him, "What do people get wrong about what you do?" Which is another way of asking, how are you misunderstood? I don't know. Tell me what this is like for you. And his face changes. He looks like a different person. And he says, "People think that I feel normal about this, keeping people in cages all day. There's nothing normal about my job." Back in the meeting, I ditched my agenda and I asked the same question again, and I kept my eyes off the business leaders, and I avoided eye contact with the city officials, and I stared down my big buddy until he went for it. He shocked everyone, told them all just what he'd told me. There's nothing normal about my job. And it's a huge opening. And now others are ready to share. And because I don't know anything, I keep asking questions. And one by one, they all have their chance to describe everything about their day-to-day, minute-to-minute work, which means everyone's getting heard by everyone. My naive questions make it possible for them to hear one another because they're not addressing each other head on. They're answering my questions, but they're all hearing it. Rule number 3. Keep quiet, especially when they start talking. It's tempting to direct the conversation. I didn't interfere, and they opened up collaboration that was unprecedented in Chicago. The guards and the previously incarcerated, business leaders and faith leaders, all bringing their expertise together, joining forces so that inmates would have a mentor waiting for them and a job lined up before their release from jail. All as a result of that conversation. I'll give you one more. In Northern Ireland for 30 years, bombs could rip through restaurants, bars, and shops at any moment. Violence was everywhere. Shootings, abductions, people lived in fear. This period is known as the Troubles. I led some tough conversations in Belfast, the epicenter of the fighting. I remember these enormous murals, paintings of masked gunmen, one of them pointing a rifle right down at you as you walked past. My job was to help Protestants and Catholics, Loyalists and Republicans have some very difficult conversations. We moved toward the conflict, rule number 1, by recruiting men who had committed acts of political violence. During armed conflict, fighters become heroes, and afterward, they remain influential, so we did everything we could to include them. Now, it would have been easier not to recruit combatants. The atmosphere wouldn't have been as charged. But remember, move toward the conflict. Rule number 2, you don't know anything, and even if you do, pretend you don't. No advice from me, no commentary, no ideas. Those are all shortcuts. And the point here is to take the long way. The more I asked, the more they shared. The more they shared, the more they listened. And the more they listened, the more they began to accept silence as a part of their experience. Which gets us to rule number 3. Keep quiet. Show them that silence is okay, that it's acceptable. And what will happen then is that the group will start to hear new voices. And often it's one of these voices that can bring about a breakthrough. And so in one of these meetings, we suddenly heard from a man who hadn't spoken. He shared his experience as a newcomer to Belfast, standing on a bus, exhausted after work, and suddenly being surrounded by a group of men. They came in really close, whispered horrible threats. They trapped him. And he explained how his heart pounded and he just gripped the railing of the bus and waited until it stopped and he could dash out. He had feared for his life that day, he told the group, and he had hoped that immigrating to Northern Ireland from Somalia would have been the end of having to fear for his life. The room fell totally quiet. Everyone heard him, Protestants, Catholics. Suddenly it didn't matter. That's unacceptable, the first said. That's not Belfast, said the second. Not how we want it to be, says the third. Now, these are men who have taken lives, who've devastated many families, in some cases their own, and now they start finishing each other's sentences about tolerance, inclusion, and respect, and this builds and builds in the room until finally I can't resist the irony, and so I announce, well, mission accomplished. Let's go to Disneyland. And they all turn and stare at me and start laughing, all of them. They laughed hard for minutes. And what that laughter gave way to was a deeper discussion than they'd ever had before. They talked about what kind of future they all hoped for their kids and their grandkids. Now here's the thing. Our man on the bus who experienced that terrifying moment, he might not have spoken if I had avoided the conflict, held forth with my own ideas, and rushed to fill every silence. I moved toward the conflict. I didn't presume to know, which meant I kept asking questions, and for the most part, I kept quiet. These rules helped him to speak, and these rules helped the group to hear him. And in the end, his story was just what they needed to hear to move forward together. One conversation can change everything. I think of the corrections officer who said, "There's nothing normal about my job," and the opening that created for the group. I think of the moment when he and the gang leader at the end of that meeting embraced one another and how powerful they became as partners. I think of the men in Belfast who hid their faces in ski masks to bring great violence into each other's lives. Today they know each other's faces and first names. They were enemies and they're neighbors now. I think of the CEOs and healthcare leaders and technology innovators I've seen transform their teams and reach their goals, all starting with one conversation. I think of the lives saved, the jobs created, the dreams achieved. So back to your conversation, the one that people around you really need to have, the one that you can lead. It can feel like a concrete maze the size of 72 football fields. But there's almost always a way through, and you'll find the way through by moving toward the conflict, asking questions, and keeping quiet. Conversations create the future. Whether or not we have them, and how we have them, is up to us. Thank you.
I hope you found this video instructive. I have to say I've used it quite a bit, particularly in working with high-performing teams. There's a situation I can recall where working with doctors and nurses in this particular hospital that were trying to come together to solve some really deep trust and respect issues, as well as working with a team where sales department and the production department again had some real trouble in deep trust and respect issues. And I find that this process really helps in terms of getting the conversation started. So let's just recap some of the highlights. If you recall, rule number 1, move toward the conflict. Don't avoid the conflict, lean into it. Acknowledge the conflict is clear, in clear, direct language. And believe that there is an angel in disguise waiting to be revealed. Believe that there's something there that they all need to know about each other and about the conflict. The second thing is you don't know anything. There's a saying is, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. People really want to get a sense of where you allow them to feel relevant and validated in the moment. And that really ties really to the first bullet point. And then give people a chance to understand and find meaning. And that's what this whole idea is, I don't know anything, because you're giving people the opportunity to be understood. Second area is to keep quiet. Don't rush the conversation, don't direct the conversation, and allow new voices to emerge and be heard. And sometimes those new voices is another person, could be another member on the team that for whatever reason have not spoke up in meetings before, or even in a one-on-one conversation. That new voice could mean someone is moving out of their head and into their heart and sharing something deep inside when you give them the opportunity and that feeling of where it's safe and okay to do that. Another part of handling difficult conversations is dealing in situations where difficult decisions need to be made. particularly when you're in a process where you have to facilitate a conversation around a decision where there could be loss as relates to that decision. And here we have Dr. Dehendra, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from Columbia Business School, who teaches this whole area of personal leadership and success, which gets into a lot of work in the dynamics of conversation and dealing with difficult conversations. And he uses a lot of clips from various movies to make his points, which makes his class very interesting. There's one that we'll show here from the movie Up in the Air, in which he talks about the dynamic of difficult conversations. He'll give you an intro, get into the movie, and then come out on the other side and talk about some of the learnings there. Now I have to warn that there's a few words that are a bit wild when he shows the movie clip. But what it does is it establishes the real world situation of what happens when emotions are high. So I'll start it.
From time to time, we encounter moments when we have to have a very difficult conversation with someone. A conversation where we feel there's really no way for both parties to come out feeling pleased or happy or connected with each other. Have you had a moment like that in recent times? So what I want to do is offer up an example to you from this movie, Up in the Air, of a situation where George Clooney, the main actor in this film, is thrust into a role where he is a restructuring expert. He's coming into companies and helping, among other things, do the painful job of helping them execute layoffs in the company. And in this scene, you'll see him in action with one of his junior colleagues, someone who's just recently joined the firm that he's part of to perform that kind of service for their clients. And you'll see them go through the acts of having conversations, to tell people that this is going to be their last day on the job, painfully so. Why don't you watch this clip and then let's come back and talk some more.
You and I are sitting here today because this will be your last week of employment at this company.
Why me?
What am I supposed to do now?
Am I supposed to feel better that I'm not the only one losing my job?
This is ridiculous. I have been a fine employee for over 10 years, and this is the way you treat me.
How you sleep at night, man? Huh? How's your family? They sleeping well at night? Electricity still on? Heat still on? Refrigerator full of food? Gas tank full of gas? Going Chuck E. Cheese this weekend or something? Not me. No, my kids, we're not gonna do anything.
What do you suggest I tell them?
Perhaps you're underestimating the positive effect that your career transition can have on your children.
The positive effect? Make about 90 grand a year now. Unemployment is what, $250 a week? Is that one of your positive effects? Well, we'll get to be cozier because I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage on my house, so maybe we can move into a nice fucking one-bedroom apartment somewhere. And I guess without benefits, I'll be able to hold my daughter as she, suffers from her asthma that I won't be able to afford the medication for.
Well, tests have shown that children under moderate trauma have a tendency to apply themselves academically as a method of coping.
Go fuck yourself. That's what my kids will think.
Your children's admiration is important to you?
Yeah, it was.
Well, I doubt they ever admired you, Bob.
Hey, asshole, aren't you supposed to be consoling me?
I'm not a shrink, Bob. I'm a wake-up call. You know why kids love athletes?
I don't know, because they screw lingerie models.
No, that's why we love athletes. Kids love athletes because they follow their dreams.
Well, I can't dunk.
No, but you can cook.
What are you talking about?
Your resume says that you minored in French culinary arts. Most students, they're working the fryer at KFC, but you bust tables at Il Picador to support yourself. And then you get out of college, and you come and you work here. How much did they first pay you to give up on your dreams?
27 grand a year.
And when were you going to stop and come back and do what makes you happy?
Good question.
I see guys who work at the same company for their entire lives, guys exactly like you. They clock in, they clock out, and they never have a moment of happiness. You have an opportunity here, Bob. This is a rebirth. Now, if not for you, do it for your children.
So here's what I saw. In her case, she was using logic. She was trying to persuade on the basis of science and data and facts, and it didn't work. Because logical persuasion, although it's one of those techniques and tools that we learn throughout life, to use science, to use data, to use facts, to use logic, it doesn't always work. And what did George Clooney do? Ultimately, he appealed to this person's values, didn't he? One was the value of how he felt that this person wanted to have his kids look up at him, see him as, as a hero, as somebody they admired. And the second was this value of how he had a certain passion for cooking, which hadn't had any chance of being channeled and expressed and practiced in his career and his life so far. And he got there by being inquisitive and curious, wanting to learn a little bit about him, by actually looking at his resume, not just at the official sort of stuff that he'd done professionally or academically, but also at his hobbies, at his passions. And tuning in when the gentleman asked, something about how do you think my kids are going to take it, and sensing from that it was a very important thing for him, his relationship with his kids and his desire to want to be a good father to them. And then by tuning into that, he was able to appeal to his values. And so I want to offer up to you that there are times in our lives when we are seeking to influence people, and perhaps the right approach there may not be purely just logic, marshalling up all the facts and the data we can, but it might be to be curious and be mindful and inquisitive about who they are and what they stand for and what are some of the passions and things they value, and then see if there's a way for us to tell a story, even a story which is sometimes as harsh on the objective front as I'm going to be firing you today, but actually seek to tell the story in a form that might make it very compelling, perhaps even in some ways attractive for them, because you've been able to connect the story to their passions, to their values. Where are opportunities in your life where you might do the same?
So here what we find, particularly when we work with leaders and teams, there are a number of situations where the conversations that we need to have with our people can turn into highly emotional conversations. When it gets into performance reviews, when it gets to transfers, when it gets to demotions, when it gets to those kinds of things, and where leaders fail to realize sometimes is that when they're having that conversation, they're not just having that conversation with that individual. They're having also that conversation with several other members on the team. And those members on the team is who that individual has relationships with. So it's so important that those conversations are handled in a way that leaves the individual feeling a sense of respect and sense of dignity. And so the discussion here around having difficult conversations is one way to think about that. So let's highlight some of the key areas that were discussed there. One, in highly emotional conversations, don't try to persuade with logic, facts, and data. 2, take the time to understand fears, goals, and passions. 3, stay engaged in the conversation. Be cautious. Be mindful. Be curious. 4, in a respectful way, demonstrate that you have gained understanding about who they are and what they stand for. And 4, find a way to connect your story to their values and passions so that they can see a better future. Also, from the work of mastering the 7 steps to crucial conversation, what I'd like to do here is just highlight some of those 7 steps. And then during coaching conversations, we could talk about these 7 steps in a little bit more detail. So the first is start with the heart. What is the desired result from the conversation? What is exactly at stake? Secondly, is learn to look. Be on the lookout for a lack of mutual purpose. Continuously ask the question whether you are leading the conversation with dialogue or if you're leading the conversation with defensiveness. Also, make sure you're not trying to force your ideas onto the other person. The third one is to make it safe. When you notice that you or the others have moved away from dialogue, do something to make it more comfortable. Apologies, smile, even request for a brief timeout, and return to restore safety when things you feel are getting a little bit dicey. Third is master your story. Retrace the path and find out the facts behind the story you're telling. And when you have the facts on your side, it's hard to deny your argument. But keep in mind, as we just discussed, when emotions are high, facts and data really don't matter. Fifth is state your path. Share your facts and conclusions in a way that will make the other person feel safe. Safe enough to tell their story too. Then 6, explore others' path. A dialogue allows you to actively inquire about the other person's views. Now that you both understand each other, you can emphasize which parts that you agree with and which parts you don't agree with. And a lot of times in conversations, especially crucial conversations, so much time is spent on where there's disagreements. We've found that when you pause and say, let's first talk about where we agree and outline where those areas of agreement are, then you'll find that when you get into the areas that you disagree, you'll get a greater sense of how much of those areas are really important. And you might find that there's a greater sense where you might want to compromise. And then 7, move to action. Come up with a consensus about what will happen. Document who's going to do what by when, and settle on ways in which you both are going to follow up. Because I find where step number 7 is where you can have a great conversation, come up with some great ideas, discuss where you agree, where trust can significantly break down is where you fail to document and you fail to follow up. And then you find later on that the issues and concerns are a lot more deeper now because the lack of commitment to following through on the things that you talked about. The next step is this whole 3-step process is how to accept feedback. Now, many of you have already looked at how to accept feedback on the video from the debrief work. So if you like, you can pass by this particular section or just go to and listen to the summary steps on the back end. But I always encourage my clients to really, I find that when you listen to this, to the video that's coming up next on how to accept feedback, many of my clients say listening a second or third time, they pick up new information and they pick up new insight. Again, this is from Helen Sheen, who wrote a couple books or co-authored a couple books on difficult conversations and feedback. And again, I'm going to showcase or play her video. This is one of her TED Talks in which she talks provides a lot of good content on how to accept and use feedback. So I'll start this now.
"15 years ago, my colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Project and I wrote a book called Difficult Conversations. And I spent the last couple of decades traveling around the world helping people and organizations with some of their most challenging conversations. Now, the first thing that we do when we work with any group is that we say, well, what are your toughest conversations? What would you like some help with? And together we make a list that we can draw from throughout the day. Now, over the years, we started to notice a pattern, which is that feedback showed up on that list a lot. To put a finer point on it, feedback was on that list 100% of the time. It didn't matter what continent we were on. It didn't matter what industry we were in. It didn't even matter why they brought us in. People and organizations all over the world struggle with feedback. Now, for the first 10 years, we did what I think everybody does, which is that we taught givers how to give, more skillfully, more clearly, more often. How many of you have ever been to a session on how to give feedback? Did it help? Okay, please say yes, because I do some of that work. But your reaction echoes my own experience, which was, it helps. I mean, there's a lot you can learn, but it wasn't solving the problem. And then one day it occurred to us, you know what? In any exchange of feedback between giver and receiver, it's the receiver who's in charge. I mean, it's the receiver who decides what they're going to let in, what sense they're going to make of it, and whether and how they choose to change. I mean, maybe we've been going about this totally backwards. Maybe the key is learning how to take in the blizzard of feedback that we come in contact with every day. Because, by the way, I'm not just talking about performance reviews and other kinds of judgment and evaluation, grades, finding out how you measure up or stack up, you know, your marriage proposal, accepted, rejected. I mean, that's those kind of judgments are the most emotional kind of feedback. But I'm also just talking about everybody's suggestions for you, the little helpful parenting tips from your in-laws, right? And I'm also talking about the look in my third grader's eyes when she spots me in the audience, and those little nitpicky criticisms from my husband, which I think of less as feedback and more as just John being annoying, right? I mean, feedback is really our relationship with the world, and it's the world's relationship with us. I mean, what if we could actually see receiving feedback as a skill? And we could get better at learning from feedback, taking charge of it and driving our own learning. So we don't have to wait around for good givers to show up. Because I don't know about you, I have some good givers, wonderful mentors, but mostly my life is populated by everybody else, right? People who are terrible at doing it, don't have time for it, who are difficult themselves. What if we could draw learning out of even off-base, unfair, poorly delivered feedback? What would happen? Now, what's interesting is that we looked around and said, okay, what's out there about why it's so hard to receive feedback and what to do about it? And really, there wasn't much. But what there was some research suggesting that if we could get better at this, it would make a huge difference. There were big rewards. What the research shows is that people who go out and solicit negative feedback, and by that what they mean is they're not just fishing for compliments, they're looking for what they can improve. Those people report higher work satisfaction, they adapt more quickly in new roles, and they get higher performance reviews, which suggests that if you get better at handling everybody's feedback for you, it doesn't just change you. It changes how other people see you and experience you. Now let me ask you this. I want to invite you to think about a piece of coaching or suggestion or advice that you've received in your life that you've rejected. You didn't take it. I want to ask you, why didn't you take it? Just think about that for a moment. I mean, maybe it was just wrong. It was bad advice. Maybe you didn't trust the person giving it to you. Maybe you were actually unaware you cared about their opinion, which was unsolicited. Maybe it was confusing, or you weren't even sure how and whether you could change in that way. Maybe it was just too upsetting. Let me say right now, there are 100 people in this room. There are probably 100 reasons you didn't take the feedback. And you know what? Those are fantastic reasons to turn away feedback. Maybe. I want to say right now that getting better at receiving feedback does not obligate you to take the feedback. In fact, there are reasons why often we need boundaries, because other people's views of us can undermine our sense of self sometimes. But the problem actually is that we usually decide too soon. As human beings, we are incredibly good at something that we call wrong spotting. When feedback is incoming, I'm scanning it, because I need to figure out what's wrong with it. Who gave it to me, what they're suggesting, why they're probably giving it to me, where they gave it to me, really, at my grandmother's funeral, seriously? Because if I can find something wrong with it, well, I can set it aside, relax, and go on with my life. If it's right, I have to keep worrying about it. So we're incredibly incented to decide right away whether the feedback is right or wrong. Now, the fact that you have a triggered reaction isn't the end of the story. It's actually the beginning. Because here's the problem. You are always going to be able to find something wrong with your feedback, I promise. 90% of it might be wrong, but that last 10% might be just what you need to grow. As we looked at the hundreds and in fact thousands of reasons and reactions that we have to feedback, we found that actually they boiled down really to 3. And so there are 3 kinds of triggered reactions that human beings have all over the world to the feedback that they get. The first is what we call truth triggers. This has everything to do with, well, is the feedback correct? Is it accurate? Is the advice good advice? Truth triggers are tricky to figure out what's true. Partly because of what we call the challenge to see. The challenge to see what in the world the giver's trying to tell you, and the challenge to see yourself accurately. Because we all have blind spots. Actually, I don't have blind spots, but I know that you guys all have blind spots, right? I mean, this is the nature of blind spots. The second kind of trigger is what we call relationship triggers. All feedback lives in the relationship between giver and receiver. And often we have a bigger reaction to who's giving it to us than what they're saying. Conquering this trigger has to do with the challenge of we, to separate the who from the what, and to deal with each on its own merits. The third kind of trigger is what we call identity triggers. This is everything to do with your emotional reaction to the feedback and the story you tell about what it says about who you are. What the research suggests is that individual sensitivity to feedback, by which I mean how far you swing emotionally in the wake of feedback and how long it takes you to recover, individuals can vary by up to 3,000%. Yeah. Let me say a little bit about what we've learned about this third identity trigger, and this picture captures it for me. Many of you probably know this is Michaela Maroney, an American gymnast. Coming into the London Olympics in 2012, she was widely regarded as the very best vaulter in the world, for good reason. She had won gold at the last 5 world competitions. And she had won by such a margin that there was no question among commentators. Obviously, Michaela's got the gold. The only question is who's going to take the silver and who's going to take the bronze. She fell on her second vault, ending a 33 vault hitting streak. Despite this, she scored so highly she still took the silver. And this is a picture of her on the medal stand receiving the silver. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the research on Olympic athletes and medalists, gold, silver, bronze. Who's happiest? Gold. Hello, they won a gold. Okay, it was not a trick question. But who's next happiest? Bronze. Why? What's the story the silver medalist tells about what just happened? Oh, I just lost gold. What's the story the bronze medalist tells? Yes! Woo, I medaled! Now this reminds me of 2 things. Number 1, the story you tell about the feedback you get has a huge impact on how you feel about it. And number 2, for high achievers, like Michaela, I think it's when we let ourselves down. It's the judgments and feedback we have for ourselves that can often be hardest to deal with. This picture went viral and became a meme. with the headline, "Michaela is not impressed," suggesting she wasn't impressed with her fellow competitors. But I look at this, and I suspect she's upset with herself. Now, psychologists like Marty Seligman estimate that our reactions to events in our lives are based about 50% on genetic, inherited wiring factors, just the way you're built emotionally. About 40% based on the story you tell about what happens, and only 10% based on the actual circumstances of your life. Now, who knows whether these are exactly the right numbers, but it does suggest that in that 50% and 40%, there is a lot of play to manage identity triggers more effectively. Let me say a little bit about the wiring piece. We took a look at 3 strands of research. The first is what I'm going to call baseline. In the literature, this is sometimes called set point. The idea here is that each of us lives at some set point or baseline degree of happiness or contentment in our life. So individual events will knock you off your baseline in one direction or another, but you're going to gravitate back toward that baseline. Now, this is based partly on looking at lottery winners in the UK. About a year after they won the lottery, they're about as happy or unhappy as they were before they won. Also, people with spinal cord injuries who become paraplegics. About a year and a half later, they're about as happy or unhappy as they were before. Now, let's imagine that the scale is 1 to 10. I mean, there are people who live their lives at 9, right? Do you know these people? Like, they're unbelievably excited, thrilled about everything in their life. It really does not matter if it's big, like, oh, we got the account, or small, like, that was an amazing cup of coffee. Okay? They're really kind of annoying. They show up a lot in the resilience research, right? Because nothing can get them down. Others of us live at 2 or 3. Always just discontent, a little restless, seeing the glass half empty. Now, why does this matter for feedback? It matters because if you live at a lower set point, it affects how you take in positive feedback. It means that the volume is turned down. It doesn't give you the same emotional bounce that it gives other people. So if you're someone who says, I just don't get why people care about appreciation or positive feedback, what's the big deal? It could be because they just live at a higher baseline than you do. The other 2 factors are swing, how far do you get knocked off your baseline by feedback in one direction or another, and then sustain or recovery, how long does it take you to come back? And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about differences being up to 3,000%. Even inside your own family. Certainly inside your work team, where we're all giving and receiving feedback to each other, right? Now imagine you and I are on the same team. We get some negative feedback from the client. You're devastated. I think it's not that big a deal. This leads me to tell you, like, okay, like, you need to not take it so personally. Like, you're kind of overreacting to this. You just got to get a thicker skin if you're going to be in this business. Does this help you? No. Because now, actually, I'm just giving you feedback about how you take feedback, right? Which is really not helping. So, understanding your profile can help you understand your own reaction. So by the way, there are challenges at either end of this spectrum. If you are very sensitive to feedback, one piece of feedback can suddenly become everything, and now can become forever. The feedback becomes supersized, and you can fall into what we call the Google bias. The Google bias is as if you are Googling everything that is wrong with me. And by the way, you get 1.2 million hits. All of your past mistakes, all of your failed relationships come rushing to the fore. There are sponsored ads here from your father and your ex, right? And it seems that nothing you have ever done has been right. Now we call this the bias because your search results are driven by your search terms. You're not Googling things I'm handling relatively well. If you were, you'd get 8 million hits, and you'd start to have a more balanced picture. In the depths of the Google bias, you cannot learn. You're just too overwhelmed. And you've got to not hide under the covers and hope the feedback goes away, but dismantle those distortions so that you can see the feedback at actual size and learn from it. Now, by the way, being insensitive to feedback, or perhaps I should say undersensitive, although if you're undersensitive, you don't really care what I call you, so it doesn't really matter, has its own challenges. I mean, one thing that happens is that you don't even realize people are trying to give you feedback, right? They say, you know, Bill does it this way. And you're like, good for Bill. The other thing that can happen is even when you get it, like you understand, okay, this is something you want me to work on, I think I agree with it, I'm totally gonna work on that. It may not stick in memory, because memory is highly correlated with emotion. And if you don't have an emotional reaction to the conversation, you have the best intentions in the world, but a week later, you've forgotten about it. 6 months later, they say, you know, we talked about this. You're like, oh, right, we did, didn't we? Sorry. The third thing that can happen if you are undersensitive is that you can be too quickly dismissive of feedback. And there's kind of an interesting pattern in how we do this. People give you feedback that you're aloof or overbearing or intimidating. You think, well, that's just not true. Because I know what's true is I'm just shy or outgoing or I have high standards. Both of these things, by the way, can be true. We're describing ourselves as we know ourselves from the inside based on our good intentions. But well-intentioned people have bad impacts on others all the time. And this is still a problem that we probably need to address if you're a leader or a spouse, particularly one who would rather not become an ex-spouse. So I'm going to give you a tool that you can use that will help you lower the stakes identity-wise. Please do not leave here and go out and say to your friends and colleagues, so, do you have any feedback for me? Sheila said I'm supposed to ask you. Okay, that is a terrible question. If you are asked that question, you're thinking, feedback about what? About your personality, your parenting, your pants? I don't know what I'm supposed to talk about. And like, how honest exactly am I supposed to be? Instead, ask a different question. Ask for one thing. Ask what's one thing I'm doing, or maybe that I'm failing to do, that you think is getting in the way? What's one thing I could change about how I run our weekly meeting that you think would be an improvement? What's one thing I could change that would make a difference to you in our friendship? Notice I'm not asking, is there anything? You're assuming there's one thing. Because by the way, if you don't know what you need to be working on as a leader or a parent, you know who knows? Everybody else. Okay? They have a list. It's a secret list of all the things you do that drive them crazy, that make it harder for them to do their job or be your child. So when you ask them this, they're going to have an answer like that. They have been carrying it around with them. And by the way, a couple days later, they're going to come back with a second thing that they actually thought of, that they wish they would have said. So you might get one thing or two things. But you'll get something specific. And you get something that's worth considering and at least discussing. Look, none of this is easy. Because whatever your triggered reaction is to the feedback you get, there's a truth at the core of this that we can't get around, which is that feedback really sits at the junction of two core human needs. On the one hand, we do want to learn and grow. I mean, this is why people take up new hobbies in retirement. It is the only thing that really explains the relationship between human beings and the game of golf, right? Because that occasional good round fools us into thinking that we're getting better. So feedback should be exhilarating, but the problem is we bump into this second thing, which is the need to be accepted and respected and loved the way we are now. And the very fact of feedback suggests that how we are now is maybe not A-okay. That the people around you, closest to you, want a few more upgrades to who you are. And yet, while this helps me explain my conflicted relationship with feedback, that sometimes it's exhilarating. It's a great source of joy. It's also some of the most painful things in our lives. And yet, how many of you would say that some of the most important things you've learned in life have come from some of your most painful experiences? So what's up with that? Why can't we have a pain-free human learning system? There's part of me that wishes I could offer you that, but in the meantime, this work for me is about learning to understand and manage the pain, to enrich our relationships, and to get to the learning faster. Thank you.
So to highlight some of the 6 core strategies that she talks about in terms of getting the most out of feedback, receiving feedback well does not always mean accepting the feedback. It means engaging in the conversation skillfully, making good choices on how to use the information. And second, manage your truth, identity, and relationship triggers so that you don't get defensive and become reactive. Third is switching to and maintaining a growth mindset throughout the feedback process. See feedback as a gift that you have total control over in terms of how to use it. Adopt a more open, resilient, and value-driven identity. Otherwise, the tendency to simply reject the feedback, defend ourselves, or defend who we think we are. And finally, or 6, accept that you have complex and mixed intentions. Be accepting of the fact that everyone has blind spots, and so do you. And so throughout the coaching process and our engagement with one-on-one sessions and feedback that we will get where we see opportunities for you to get better at the feedback, we'll be using these rules and guidelines as we discuss your growth from a leadership standpoint. So that covers the 3 areas of being trustworthy, those 13 behaviors around trust, having difficult conversations, and knowing how to accept feedback. These are the dynamics of building a high trust culture. And from our experience, to the degree leaders are able to get better at developing the competencies in these 3 areas, we find that they grow in level of responsibility from a management level, to senior leadership level, to an overall enterprise level, as they understand the dynamics and the competencies across these 3 areas. Thank you.